Hello. Today we're going to look at a poem which is a masterpiece of dramatic irony, offering us an insight into the mutual attraction, mutual deception between two people, which they of course are not aware of. In Wendy Cope's First Date She and First Date He, we see two narrators who are desperate to impress on their first date. And this is a popular poem, mainly I think because it reflects so many of our experiences. You know, plenty of us will have been on a first date and you're desperate to read your partner's thoughts, your partner's feelings. You know, is that a spark of attraction? Or is she ready to fake her own death to dodge a second date? Right, we'll get a quick overview of the poem before we start picking it apart. Now, Wendy Cope's First Date is a 2-for-1 deal, really. You're getting two internal monologues offering up the thoughts and feelings of a man and a woman on their first date together. They're internal monologues because neither narrator is privy or aware of the other's thoughts and feelings. And both poems employ an A-B-C-B rhyme scheme, and we can perceive the narrator's attempts to deceive each other into believing that they're slightly more culturally sophisticated than they actually are. I mean, that explains the venue for this date. It's not a pub or a nightclub, it's a classical music concert. And the good news is there's a genuine spark of attraction between these two narrators. Unfortunately, neither partner is very good at communicating their feelings, and they both believe the other to be more absorbed in the music than their date. I'm a big fan of this poem. To me, it really beautifully captures the awkwardness, the anxieties, the attempts to present ourselves in a positive light that characterise first dates or blossoming romance. So we'll jump right in now to analysing an element of structure, the rhyme scheme. Or rather, not simply analysing it, but evaluating the meaning of that rhyme scheme. By which I mean looking at more than one interpretation, more than one meaning. Why is that rhyme scheme, that fixed ABCB rhyme scheme been used? And you know as well as I do, if you're offering up those multiple interpretations, that is the watermark, that is the index of a high-level student. The examiner, you can bet the farm, starts paying attention. Our first explanation for the regular rhyme scheme then, we could say it shows, because it's fixed for both monologues, that there's a degree of harmony between these two narrators. They seem to be well suited to each other. But of course we're not stopping there. No sir, let's look at this secondary interpretation. You could also argue that that fixed rhyme scheme, that fixed structure, alludes to the partner's attempt to control their anxieties. You've got a very controlled, fixed rhyme scheme, and that mirrors the way that these people, these narrators, carefully calculate their behaviour towards each other. They're very constrained or restrained in what they reveal to each other. My stars, Mr. Taylor, are you really offering up a third interpretation? That examiner's going to be scuffing his kneecaps in a bid to get down and kiss my boots. Here's our third and final interpretation for that fixed rhyme scheme. It may imply that the partners feel trapped in the roles that they've made for themselves as cultured or highbrow individuals, you know, pretending to have that interest in the classical music. Now, I won't bore you or creep you out with my own romantic history, even if you did have 8 seconds to spare. But what I will say is the advantage of offering to take a girl to the theatre or a classical music concert is twofold. Firstly, it suggests that you're a sensitive, modern man, you know, not just some knuckle-dragging caveman. The other advantage is if you're a bit nervous and nebbish, then you don't have to talk to her for 2 hours. You know, bonus. We're going to look at a language technique now. And if you've never heard of it before, I don't want you to freak out, because I get it. When you're trying to come to grips with a difficult poem and then some idiot tosses a high-level term at you, it can really throw you. So yes, there's a high-level term coming up, but I promise, like a lot of high-level terms, the explanation behind it is painfully simple. So this poem, First Date, contains a lot of language from the semantic field of vision. You've got words like glance, which is repeated 3 times, half dark, appear, picture, and glasses. Now, you might have worked out that semantic field just means a group of words that are linked by common theme. For example, beer, darts, optics, bar stool, barfly. These are words drawn from the semantic field of pubs. Exam, students, detention, graduate. These are words drawn from the semantic field of education. So it's just a group of words unified or united by a common theme. Ho ho ho. Oh, Mr. Taylor, you and your kooky cartoons, I don't know. A joke about glasses, please. Stop making a spectacle of yourself. Back to business then, after that painfully naff joke. This language in the poem that's drawn from the semantic field of vision, this has a purpose. What it does is it helps to foreground or emphasise the narrator's attempts to appear a certain way in the eyes of the other. But there's a secondary interpretation too, if you want it. We could say that using this language drawn from the semantic field of vision, this creates humour, or if you really advance, it creates irony, because what each narrator fails to see is the other's attraction towards them. So in a sense, in deceiving, these narrators are misperceiving, they're misinterpreting their partner's feelings. Another thing you might have noticed about this poem is that it doesn't run to too many metaphors. There's a lack of them. Sure, there's one or two if you look hard enough, but I think this lack of figurative imagery, similes and metaphors, is intentional. Because what it does is it makes the poem sound less literary or poetic in style. It sounds more like the genuine insights into a person's thoughts and feelings, less like a poetic construction. And I think the reason Wendy Cope is doing this is to create a sense of realism, or, here's the la-di-da term, create a sense of verisimilitude, like we're listening to two real people here. This idea is reinforced or shored up by some of the informal phrasing that's employed as well, just like your man on the street might use. Oh, his face is a picture. He's into this music. These are casual, informal phrases that make the narrator's sound that little bit more believable. Context. It makes my teeth itch when an exam board says, yes, I want you to analyse the context of this poem. And yet you go onto the internet, you look at the resources, and there's precious little out there. For Wendy Cope's first dates then, I've had to do some really deep digging to winkle out information that links the poem either to aspects of the poet's life or output, or anything to do with the era when it was written, or the kind of literary heritage, how it relates to other poems. First thing you can say in terms of contextual factors is first date is characteristic of Wendy Cope's poetry. Her most famous poem, very funny, well worth sniffing out onto the internet, is called Bloody Men. I think the first line is, bloody men are like buses. And this is another poem that deals with romantic frustration and trying to work out what a prospective partner feels or intends. This second contextual feature that I've dredged up is about as top spec as you're going to get. Now, there's a romantic era poet, late 18th, early 19th century poet called William Wordsworth, and he said that a poet should be a man speaking to men. Now, putting aside for a second the fact that this is tragically chauvinistic, maybe misogynistic in its neglect of women, what he's saying here is that a poet should avoid using lofty, poetic, literary language, and also avoid allusions to classical mythology that only very educated people understand. Wordsworth then reckons that poetry should be accessible to all. And this fascinating fact dovetails or links very nicely to Wendy Cope's lack of metaphor in this poem and that informal tone. It's almost like she's trying to make her poem as accessible as possible. We're on the final furlong now, folks. We are herring towards the finish line. I'm going to end by putting together a top spec exam style response. I'm going to build it up in layers, start with a point, and imagine the question is something like, how does Wendy Cope present romantic relationships in First Date? As I say, here's my point. In First Date, Cope employs language from the semantic field of vision to present her ideas about modern romance. Why is this a good point? Well, it responds explicitly to that exam question. The question, of course, was how does Cope present romantic relationships in First Date? I've woven in those key words: cope, present, and modern romance. I've also mentioned the language technique, the language from the semantic field of vision. The question said how, and that's how she presents this stuff. So that is a good point, appropriating as it does those key words. Next, we need to back up our point with some honest-to-goodness evidence from the text. The narrator says, when I glance at his face, it's a picture of rapt concentration. I've embedded that quotation into my own sentence rather than just saying, When I glance at his face, I've said the female narrator says, it just makes it flow that little bit better. You'll notice after picture, I've put a slash. That's just to denote a line break. Because I'm going to be a real clever Trevor later and analyse the enjambment, it doesn't hurt to show the examiner where that line break goes. So we've laid on a point, we've shored it up with evidence, now we need to lay on an explanation. That's the stuff in green. The verb glance and the noun picture serve to emphasise engagingly to the reader the humour of the situation. Both partners attempt to misrepresent themselves in the eyes of the other as classical music enthusiasts. And why is this a trillingly beautiful explanation, Mr. Taylor? I'll tell you. For a start, I've locked in on language. I've also not just said the word glance, I've said the verb, the noun. I've said what the word types are. So I've locked in on these two words, glance and picture, and said what the effect of that is. I've said, that creates humour. And I've explained how that humour is created. I've developed that point. You'll notice I've said it emphasises engagingly to the reader. The spec I'm with, EdExcel, asks you to evaluate and use evaluative language. Engagingly suggests he's doing this rather well, and you appreciate that. You've also got to say with my spec, EdExcel, to the reader. You've got to stress that the effect of the poetic techniques is on the reader, as opposed to the sofa or the chimney breast. So, to play the examiner's game, this serves to emphasise engagingly to the reader the humour of the situation. The other way of being evaluative, of course, is to lay on that secondary or alternative interpretation. That's the stuff in black. Moreover, the use of enjambment here cleverly captures the swift, fluent glance the narrator directs at the man. Moreover is a nice connective, launches me into that secondary interpretation, and here I'm looking at a structural technique from that evidence. I've dipped back into the evidence, found a secondary technique, and analysed the meaning of the effect of that. Conclusions. Well, I've been honking on for 10 minutes like a performing seal. I'll spare you my adenoidal tones. Have a read of this, sums up everything we've looked at in the video. And we're out of here. First dates deconstructed to gold standard specifications.